In the village of Heatherley, where holly hedgerows still held their crimson berries and the air tasted faintly of frost, no one expected a garden party in mid-January. But Lady Frances Fairgrove was not one to be told what was proper by something as trifling as weather. "It will be bracing," she declared to her maid, as she surveyed her dormant rose garden with a stubborn pride. "The village needs cheering, not hibernation." So invitations were sent. Shawls and woolen coats were readied, and by 2 o'clock on the appointed Saturday, a modest gathering of villagers, bundled against the chill and armed with thermoses of mulled wine, stood on the gravel paths of Fairgrove Manor, sipping and gossiping beneath a pale winter sun. The rose garden was the main attraction, or rather, the curiosity. There, in the middle of the barren flower beds, bloomed a single, startlingly crimson rose, an unnatural marvel in the middle of January. Some whispered that it had been forced in a hothouse and planted just that morning, while others nodded reverently, believing it a sign of something mysterious. Miss Marple, who had taken the train over from St. Mary Mead to visit her second cousin Edith, merely looked at the rose with quiet interest. "It is quite out of season," she murmured to no one in particular. But then, so many things in life are. The guests were the usual assortment of Heatherley's notable and notorious. Reverend Pinner and his stern-faced sister Agnes, Colonel Bainbridge with his stiff moustache and looser morals, Mrs. Lydia Chalmers, whose late husband's dubious finances were still a favorite subject in the post office queue, and young Dr. Felix Hartwell, recently returned from London after his mysterious leave of absence, which he refused to explain. Then there was Lady Frances herself, tall, elegant, with silver hair swept into a chignon that defied both wind and age. She stood near the rose, beaming at the crowd with the smug satisfaction of a woman whose eccentricity was indulged rather than questioned. "It's a hybrid Perpetua elegans," she announced, gesturing grandly toward the bloom. "Rare, but with the right hands and a little luck. One can coax beauty from even the cruelest season." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her blue eyes resting not on the rose, but on the shoes of Lady Frances. The mud on the sole looked too thick for a woman who claimed not to have entered the garden all week. The moment shattered shortly after the first tray of scones was served. It was young Alice Bromley, maid to Lady Frances, who screamed first. She had gone to fetch extra napkins from the side parlour. Moments later, she re-emerged, eyes wild, a corner of lace clutched in her hand, her voice shaking. "Milady, it's him, Mr. Denham. He's dead." Gasps rippled like frost breaking on a pond. Mr. Julian Denham was Lady Frances's estate agent, a quiet man with a precise manner and a distaste for parties. No one had noticed his absence, not even Lady Frances. But now everyone rushed to the side parlour, crowding the small threshold. He lay slumped in a Queen Anne chair, the embroidery on the cushion darkened with spilled tea, or something thicker. His eyes stared upward, unblinking. A teacup rested beside him, perfectly upright, as though he had simply dozed off. But no one in Heatherley, or St. Mary Mead for that matter, could mistake death when it arrived. Miss Marple did not gasp. She did not rush forward. She stood quietly behind the crowd, observing the reactions rather than the scene. Dr. Hartwell pushed through to kneel by the body, his fingers pressed to Denham's wrist. "He's gone," the doctor said softly. "I believe some time ago." "A heart attack?" asked Lady Frances, her voice oddly measured. "Perhaps," Dr. Hartwell replied, but his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple caught the flicker in his eyes. Not fear, recognition. Someone began weeping. The Reverend Pinner muttered a prayer. Colonel Bainbridge demanded the police. The garden party was over, and winter had returned in earnest. Miss Marple, warming her fingers on a forgotten cup of tea, watched the red rose sway gently in the wind. A rose blooming out of season, and now a death without cause. How curious. The police arrived just past 4, their presence marked by the crunch of tires on gravel and a flurry of anxious glances from the guests, who still loitered in uncertain clusters across the lawn and inside the drawing room. Lady Frances had withdrawn almost at once, declaring herself overcome, though not before issuing very firm instructions that no one was to leave the premises. It was, she said, a matter of civic duty. Though Miss Marple noted she gave the order with the same steely firmness she might use when discussing hedge maintenance or parish council budget disputes. Detective Sergeant Cray, a thick-set man with practical boots and a slightly condescending air, took charge quickly. He questioned those closest to the body first, including young Alice Bromley, who had by now been calmed with warm brandy and a shawl and was still hiccuping into a lace handkerchief. "I thought he was asleep," she whispered to Cray, her voice trembling. "The cup next to him, it weren't spilled. Not a drop, sir. But he didn't move. Just sat there, eyes open, like that." Cray scribbled this down, clearly unconvinced of its relevance. Miss Marple, sitting with her second cousin Edith on a nearby settee, was close enough to hear. She kept her hands folded over her knitting bag, though she had not touched her needles since the scream. Her attention, as always, was fixed not on the body itself, but on the people around it. She watched Dr. Hartwell especially. He had remained near the parlor doorway after examining Mr. Denham, but his eyes never strayed far from the teacup on the table. At one point, he leaned slightly forward, as if to take a closer look, but then caught himself and stepped back. Miss Marple noticed the movement just as she noticed how Colonel Bainbridge was quick to denounce the idea of murder. "Absolute nonsense," the colonel barked to a knot of onlookers. Denham was always pale, always nervous, heart like wet paper. If you ask me, he simply popped off. No foul play needed. "But he wasn't ill," murmured Mrs. Lydia Chalmers, sipping her second glass of sherry. "He always walked to the village, rain or shine. Never missed his church pew. Rather fastidious about health, as I recall." The whisper passed through the room like a cold draught. Detective Sergeant Cray soon called for Dr. Hartwell again. "You were the first to examine the body, Doctor. Cause of death?" Hartwell hesitated. Difficult to say definitively without an autopsy. There were no obvious signs, no visible trauma, but the skin tone around the lips, slightly bluish. It's possible he was poisoned. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. "Poison," gasped Agnes Pinner. "But who would do such a thing, and why?" A sudden hush followed. It was one thing to speak of fainting or illness, another entirely to entertain the idea of murder. Here, in the warm, respectable drawing room of Lady Frances Fairgrove. Miss Marple shifted ever so slightly in her chair, her expression one of gentle, puzzled concern. "Such a dreadful thing, poor Mr. Denham," she said, almost dreamily. "He was always so tidy. I remember watching him once, at tea with Lady Frances, months ago. He stirred his sugar 3 times, never more, and always placed the spoon parallel to the saucer. Such habits do tend to suggest a careful mind." Cray gave her a bland look, the kind given to old ladies prone to wandering comments. But Miss Marple saw the flicker in Hartwell's eye, a sharp, involuntary glance toward the parlor again. Something troubled him. Outside, a light snow began to fall, coating the gravel paths and the now deserted rose garden with a delicate veil of white. It made the red rose at the center appear even more unnatural. Miss Marple's gaze drifted out the frosted window to it, and she frowned slightly, not at the flower, but at the memory of something very small, a petal on the floor. She had seen it when the crowd gathered around the parlor door. A single red petal on the carpet, detached, slightly crumpled, yet the bloom outside had been intact, even pristine. She tucked the observation away quietly. By 6 o'clock, the garden party had fully transformed into a locked room investigation. Cray allowed no one to leave the house. Statements were taken. Tea was served again, this time reluctantly and under watchful eyes. Lady Frances emerged eventually, her composure restored and her voice clipped with purpose. "Detective, you may use my study for your inquiries. And I suggest you speak to Mr. Denham's assistant, Mr. Forbes. He'll have insight into Julian's dealings, though I can assure you, nothing in my estate affairs could provoke this." Her eyes flared just briefly as she said it. Pride, perhaps, or something more guarded. Miss Marple noticed. Mr. Lionel Forbes was summoned shortly thereafter. A twitchy man with a long nose and fingers stained with fountain pen ink. He appeared uncomfortable in the grand drawing room, blinking at the assembled guests as though he'd wandered into the wrong party entirely. I only handled the papers," he stammered. "Mr. Denham rarely spoke about clients. Lady Frances was his chief concern. He managed her property portfolio almost exclusively." "And were there any disputes?" Cray asked. "Anything financial?" Forbes hesitated. "Not exactly disputes, but I do remember he received a letter just yesterday. Looked rather grim after reading it. I offered to take dictation for a reply, but he waved me off. Said he'd handle it personally." The word landed with weight. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you happen to notice the letter's return address?" Forbes furrowed his brow. "I believe it was local. Came in a plain envelope. I didn't see the full name, but I recall the handwriting. Rather elegant, old-fashioned." A quiet voice from the corner added, "Might have been mine." All heads turned. It was Reverend Pinner. "I wrote to Mr. Denham this week," the Reverend said, his face tight. "About the sale of the old vicarage. There were irregularities. I thought perhaps Lady Frances had been misinformed about certain terms." "I was not, Reverend," Lady Frances snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. Miss Marple, ever gentle, gave a faint smile. "Property matters are often complicated," she said, "especially where long histories are concerned." The guests, tired and chilled, began to drift into separate rooms. The police remained, canvassing the house, inspecting cups, calling in a local coroner. Miss Marple remained seated. She watched the fire burn lower in the grate and saw across the room the pale reflection of Dr. Hartwell in the window glass. He was watching someone, not her, but Lady Frances, and he looked very much afraid. Later, as the clock struck 9 and the last of the tea things had been cleared, Miss Marple stood and made her way down the corridor. She moved without sound, as only old ladies and cats can do, and paused at the parlor where Mr. Denham's body had been taken away. The cup was still there, marked and tagged but untouched. The spoon had been removed, but the faint trace of something white clung to the rim. She looked to the fireplace. The ashes were fresh, but not from wood. Paper, burnt and twisted. Miss Marple bent slightly. A corner had survived, protected by the iron grate. She used a crochet hook from her bag to tease it free. One word remained. Elegans. Her eyes moved from the grate to the garden beyond. The rose. The impossible bloom. Not just decorative, deliberate. And somewhere in the house, someone was watching the snow cover their secret, believing it safely buried. Miss Marple, with a look of quiet satisfaction, returned to her knitting. The pattern had begun to emerge, subtle and soft, but undeniably there. Tomorrow, she thought, would be a good day to ask about gardening habits and poisons. She had always found people rather careless with both. Morning dawned pale and cold over Heatherley, the frost still clinging stubbornly to the window panes of Fairgrove Manor, as Miss Marple stirred in the guest room she had been assigned. Her sleep had been light, restless, with fragments of thoughts about the red rose and the burnt paper. She dressed quietly, her hands steady despite the quiet turmoil the death of Julian Denham had cast over the village. By the time she descended the main staircase, the household was stirring, though the usual cheerful bustle had been replaced by a tense hush. Lady Frances was already in the drawing room, seated stiffly near the hearth, her eyes sharp as she glanced toward the door. "Miss Marple," she greeted crisply. "I trust you slept well enough, considering." "As well as can be expected," Miss Marple replied, inclining her head. "And you?" "Like a woman awaiting a verdict," Lady Frances said dryly. "This business must be resolved swiftly for the sake of the estate and the village's reputation." Miss Marple nodded, settling herself in an armchair near the fire. "I understand the police are conducting a thorough investigation." "Yes," Lady Frances said, her voice dropping slightly. "Detective Sergeant Cray is here, but I sense the official inquiry is only scratching the surface." "Sometimes it takes patience," Miss Marple said quietly, "and the right questions." The door opened then, and Mr. Lionel Forbes stepped in, his expression still uneasy. "Lady Frances, Miss Marple," he greeted. "I thought it best to report that I found something unusual when going through Mr. Denham's papers this morning." Lady Frances's eyes narrowed. "And what might that be?" Forbes hesitated. "An unsigned letter addressed to Mr. Denham. It was hidden beneath a stack of account books, folded carefully." He handed over the document, and Miss Marple unfolded it with care. The handwriting was elegant, the ink slightly faded, but the message was clear. "Your meddling in matters beyond your purview has consequences. Cease immediately, or face ruin." No signature, no return address. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "A threat, then?" Lady Frances folded her hands. "My estate is well managed. If Julian's been receiving threats, I must know from whom." "Has anyone else received such warnings?" Miss Marple asked gently. Forbes shook his head. "Not to my knowledge, ma'am, but Mr. Denham was discreet about his troubles." "Discretion can be dangerous," Miss Marple mused. At that moment, the door opened again. Dr. Felix Hartwell entered, his face grave. "Detective Cray wishes to speak to everyone gathered here this morning. He intends to review statements before proceeding." The guests assembled slowly in the drawing room, a mix of curiosity and apprehension evident on every face. The Reverend Pinner sat stiffly beside his sister Agnes, while Mrs. Lydia Chalmers exchanged guarded glances with Colonel Bainbridge. Young Alice Bromley lingered near the doorway, clutching a thick shawl around her shoulders. Cray, notebook in hand, began systematically. "I want to clarify timelines. Where was each of you between 2 and 4 yesterday afternoon?" Answers varied, some certain, others vague. Lady Frances had been overseeing the garden preparations. Forbes had been in the study organizing papers. Dr. Hartwell claimed to have been in his surgery, attending to patients. The rest had been mingling at the party or tending to personal errands. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting inconsistencies not in the words but in the manner of delivery. Colonel Bainbridge, for example, was quick to offer his timeline, his tone almost rehearsed. Mrs. Chalmers seemed uneasy, glancing toward the window frequently. Reverend Pinner's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them. When Cray turned to Alice Bromley, she spoke clearly despite lingering nerves. "I fetched fresh napkins from the side parlor around 3:15. That's when I found Mr. Denham." "Did you see anyone else near the parlor?" Cray asked. Alice shook her head. "No, sir. I came straight in and called out." The questioning continued, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled the red petal found yesterday and the burnt fragment marked elegans. The rose, Lady Frances's prized hybrid, blooms out of season, seemed more than mere decoration. It was a symbol, a message. After the formal inquiry, Miss Marple requested a private word with Lady Frances. "You have an extraordinary rose in your garden," she began. "Is it common knowledge how you managed to coax such a bloom this time of year?" Lady Frances's eyes glinted. "I've employed a local horticulturist, Mr. Jameson, a quiet man, keeps to himself. He has a remarkable talent with plants." Do you trust him? Lady Frances paused. I trust his skill. The rest is unknown. But why do you ask? Miss Marple hesitated, choosing her words. Because sometimes, when people nurture things in secret, it tells us more about their character than they intend. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the gardener's shed at the edge of the grounds. Mr. Jameson was a thin man, his face weathered and hands rough from toil. You have quite a skill, Mr. Jameson, she said, watching him prune a rose bush. But tell me, have you ever worked with poisons? Jameson looked up sharply. Poisons? No, ma'am. Just fertilizers and pesticides, as every gardener does. Miss Marple nodded. And the Perpetua elegans. Does it bloom naturally in winter? Never, Jameson replied firmly. That rose requires very careful treatment. Heat, light, and a special nutrient mix. It's rare and expensive. Could the bloom be used to hide something? Perhaps a trace of poison? Jameson frowned. I wouldn't think so. Roses aren't generally poisonous, though some parts can irritate. But poison? Number that would be the work of someone else. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. Your candor is appreciated. Back at the manor, the day passed with a slow gathering of whispers and guarded conversations. Miss Marple found herself seated once again near the fire, knitting calmly while listening to the undercurrent of gossip. Mrs. Chalmers spoke to Edith in low tones. There was talk, before Julian Denham came here, of a business gone sour. Something about lost investments and a falling out with a partner. Edith nodded. I heard that too, but no one knows the details. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Secrets have a way of growing in small villages, much like roses, sometimes hidden beneath the thorns. As evening fell, Detective Sergeant Cray gathered the household once more. We have arranged for an autopsy to confirm the cause of death. Meanwhile, I expect everyone to remain available for further questioning. Lady Frances's lips pressed into a thin line. I trust you will find justice swiftly, Sergeant. Cray's reply was curt but firm. Miss Marple, rising quietly, felt a keen awareness of the tension in the room. The pieces were aligning, threatening letters, a suspicious rose, the varied accounts of those present, and beneath it all, the ever-present weight of human nature. Pride, fear, resentment, and greed. She made a silent vow to watch carefully, to listen not just to words, but to silences. The rose that bloomed in winter was more than a marvel. It was a clue, and somewhere among these people, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm against the growing storm. The morning light filtered softly through the frost-veiled windows of Fairgrove Manor as the household gathered once more in the drawing room, the air thick with quiet tension. The autopsy report had arrived early, delivered discreetly by Dr. Hartwell himself, who lingered near the doorway, exchanging furtive glances with Detective Sergeant Cray before retreating to his study. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting a delicate pattern that seemed to mimic the intricate weaving of the case itself. She listened as Cray cleared his throat and addressed the group with measured gravity. The post-mortem confirms our initial suspicions. Mr. Denham was poisoned. The substance, aconitine, derived from the monkshood plant, also known as wolfsbane. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Poisoned by aconitine. Lady Frances's voice trembled slightly, though she quickly masked it. But that is a rare and dangerous toxin. How could someone have administered it without detection? Cray's gaze swept over the assembled faces. That is precisely what we need to determine. Miss Marple's mind raced, recalling the gardener's firm denial that any poison had been used in tending the rare rose. Yet aconitine was a well-known botanical poison, extracted from a plant that could easily be cultivated, and, more importantly, concealed. I imagine, she said softly, that the killer relied on the fact that such a poison would not be immediately suspected. It is as subtle as it is deadly. Cray nodded, appreciating her insight more than he let on. The victim consumed tea shortly before his death. We found traces of aconitine in the cup. The eyes of the room darted toward the now infamous teacup still set on the low table, its porcelain rim bearing the faintest trace of residue. Miss Marple glanced at it thoughtfully, then looked to the assembled guests. "Who had access to Mr. Denham's tea?" she asked. "Forrest and I served the refreshments," said Alice Bromley, her voice steady despite the weight of the question. "But everyone was free to make their own drinks after the initial service." Lady Frances spoke up. "Julian was particular about his tea. I often saw him prepare it himself." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Dr. Hartwell, who had come forward at that moment. "I was near the kitchen most of the afternoon," he explained, "but I cannot say with certainty who handled Mr. Denham's cup last." "Did anyone notice if Mr. Denham's cup was ever left unattended?" Cray asked. Several people exchanged uneasy looks. Mrs. Chalmers hesitated before speaking. There was a moment, I recall, when he stepped outside briefly, leaving the cup on the table. "That could have been enough time," Miss Marple murmured. The conversation turned to possible motives, the room growing heavier with each suggestion. The threat letter was mentioned again, its mysterious origin casting suspicion in multiple directions. Miss Marple observed Lady Frances's steely composure, the tightness around her mouth, the quickness with which she dismissed any hint of financial trouble. The Reverend Pinner, with his usual solemnity, offered a different angle. Mr. Denham was a man burdened by secrets, I'm sure. Some of those secrets may have made enemies, people desperate enough to kill. Miss Marple looked directly at him. "You suggested there were irregularities in the sale of the old vicarage." The Reverend nodded gravely. "Yes, and I suspect Julian was meddling in matters that would unsettle powerful people." Miss Marple pondered this. The intertwining of local affairs, personal grudges, and hidden scandals was exactly the kind of web that could ensnare an unsuspecting victim. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple requested a moment alone with Detective Sergeant Cray. "There is more to this than meets the eye," she said quietly. "I believe the poison was not the only weapon employed." Cray raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Look at the red rose," she said, nodding toward the window. "A bloom out of season, kept under artificial conditions. Its petals may have been used to disguise a smaller, yet crucial clue." Cray frowned, intrigued. "A clue hidden in a flower." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed. I noticed a single petal on the carpet yesterday. It did not match the state of the rose outside. Why would someone do that? Perhaps to draw attention away from something more subtle or to mislead investigators." Cray considered this, then said, "I'll have the rose examined immediately." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Lady Frances, who had returned to the room and now stood quietly near the door. "Lady Frances," Miss Marple said gently, "how well did you know Mr. Denham's business dealing?" Lady Frances's expression tightened. "Better than most, I would think. He managed my estate with great care, but he was also involved in other affairs that were not public knowledge." "Such as?" "Some investments, risky but promising. Others, less so." Miss Marple's mind whirred with possibilities. Risky investments, threats, a rare poison, and a flower that bloomed in winter. All pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming together, yet still incomplete. Later, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple wandered into the garden, her eyes tracing the delicate outline of the rosebush bathed in the fading light. The gardener, Mr. Jameson, was nearby, tending to other plants with methodical care. "Mr. Jameson," she called softly, "do you mind if I ask you about the use of monkshood in the garden?" Jameson paused, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Monkshood? It's a poisonous plant, yes, but quite common in certain gardens. We have a small patch behind the greenhouse. though it's never been used for anything but display. Is it possible for its poison to be extracted and administered discreetly? In theory, yes, Jameson said cautiously, but that would require knowledge and intent. Dangerous knowledge. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I think this is important. Returning to the manor, she found Dr. Hartwell waiting in the hall. Doctor, she said quietly, I gather you have been uneasy these past days. Hartwell gave a weary sigh. I have, Miss Marple. There is more to Mr. Denham's death than simple accident or even murder. Some truths are deeply buried here. Miss Marple's eyes met his steadily. Do you think someone is trying to hide something? Indeed, and I fear it may involve more than one person. Her knitting needles clicked gently as she said, Then we must be patient and watchful. That evening, the Ion household gathered again for a muted dinner, the atmosphere strained but civil. Conversations were cautious, eyes darting, and alliances subtly shifting. Miss Marple observed closely, her mind cataloguing every glance, every hesitation. When the meal ended, she sought out Alice Bromley, who was quietly clearing dishes. Alice, she said softly, you have been very brave through all this. Alice looked up, startled but pleased by the kindness. Thank you, Miss Marple. I just want to see justice done. Do you remember anything unusual about Mr. Denham's behavior the day before his death? Alice hesitated, then nodded slowly. He seemed worried, more than usual. I saw him speak briefly with a man near the village square, someone I didn't recognize. Miss Marple's interest piqued. Can you describe this man? Tall, dark hair, clean-shaven. He wore a long coat and spoke quietly, but I heard the name Fairgrove mentioned. A chill passed through Miss Marple's spine. A connection between the visitor and the family estate. Thank you, Alice. You've been very helpful. As night settled over Heatherley, Miss Marple retired to her room, thoughts racing. The strands of mystery tangled ever tighter. The threat letter, the rare poison, the clandestine visitor, and the winter-blooming rose. She placed her knitting aside and looked out into the dark garden where shadows lengthened and secrets stirred. Tomorrow, she resolved, would reveal much and perhaps bring the killer one step closer to exposure. The following morning dawned misty and gray over Heatherley, the soft chill in the air mirroring the unease that still clung to Fairgrove Manor. Miss Marple rose early, restless with the mounting puzzle pieces she had been quietly assembling. Over a modest breakfast in the servants' hall, she exchanged few words with Alice Bromley, who seemed tired but resolute, her youthful face shaded with a seriousness beyond her years. The day's routine was interrupted when a discreet knock sounded at the manor's library door. Miss Marple opened it to find Detective Sergeant Cray standing just inside, his notebook clutched tightly in his hand, eyes sharp and alert. Good morning, Miss Marple. May I have a moment? Of course, Sergeant. I was hoping to speak with you before the day's inquiries began, she said, stepping aside to let him in. Cray's glance swept the room, noting the rows of books and the gentle warmth from the fireplace. I appreciate your discretion. I've been reviewing the statements from yesterday and the autopsy results. The use of aconitine is unusual here, but there's something else. Someone has been tampering with the victim's financial records. It's subtle, but deliberate. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I suspected there was more to Julian Denham's troubles than simple estate matters. Did you discover who might benefit? That's what we're trying to determine. His ledger shows irregular withdrawals and payments to an unknown party. I've asked Forbes to produce the originals, but so far, the trail leads nowhere concrete. Money often reveals more than words, Miss Marple murmured. And yet, it is the human element, the emotions beneath, that unlocks the truth. Cray nodded, his respect for her insight deepening. I agree. There is something about the way the household behaves, hidden tensions, unspoken grievances. I'm hoping your observations can guide us. Miss Marple smiled gently. Then we shall continue to listen and watch. Sometimes it is the silences that speak loudest. Later that morning, the manor's parlor buzzed quietly as Lady Frances summoned several of the household for a private discussion. Miss Marple, ever discreet, slipped in unnoticed and took a seat near the window, watching as the conversation unfolded. Lady Frances's voice was firm but strained. We cannot allow these rumors to spread unchecked. I've already lost enough to scandal. Mr. Lionel Forbes, adjusting his spectacles nervously, replied, Indeed, Lady Frances, but if the truth comes out, it will be better in the light than hidden in shadows. Mrs. Lydia Chalmers, sitting stiffly, added, Some things are better left unspoken. Not all secrets are meant to be unveiled. Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease that crossed Lady Frances's face at this remark, but she said nothing aloud. The delicate balance of power and fear was plainly visible. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple approached Forbes quietly. Mr. Forbes, might I review the financial records you mentioned to Detective Cray? He looked startled, but nodded. Certainly. They're in the study, though I must warn you, they are quite complex. In the study, illuminated by the weak afternoon light filtering through heavy curtains, Miss Marple examined the ledgers. Careful numbers, dates, and names filled the pages. It was the unusual payments that caught her eye. Small sums, regular to an obscure name. R. Langford. Have you heard of this person? She asked Forbes. He shook his head slowly. No, but I can ask around. It might be someone Julian dealt with discreetly. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire further. Financial deception was often a symptom of deeper troubles, a mask for resentment or desperation. Later, while strolling through the manor's extensive gardens, Miss Marple encountered Reverend Pinner, who appeared uneasy as he adjusted his clerical collar. Good afternoon, Reverend, she greeted gently. Miss Marple, he replied, his voice low. I wish to speak with you privately, if I may. She inclined her head and followed him to a quiet bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. The Reverend's hands trembled slightly as he sat down. There are things I have not spoken of, he confessed. About the sale of the old vicarage. Julian Denham was involved, but the deal was not as straightforward as it seemed. There were promises made, then broken. People hurt. Miss Marple listened intently, her eyes soft but probing. Broken promises often breed resentment. Did you sense hostility toward Mr. Denham? More than hostility, the Reverend admitted. Fear, too. He was uncovering things some wished to keep buried. Who might that be? She asked quietly. He hesitated, then said, I believe the answer lies with those closest to the estate, but I fear speaking their names aloud would only bring harm. Miss Marple nodded, understanding the weight of unspoken truths. Sometimes the courage to remain silent is a form of protection, but it can also shelter secrets that fester. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself in the kitchen where Alice Bromley was helping prepare a modest supper for the staff. The young woman's hands trembled as she peeled potatoes, but her eyes were steady. Alice, Miss Marple said softly, I wonder if you might tell me more about the man you saw speaking with Mr. Denham in the village square. Alice's brow furrowed in concentration. He seemed important, but he spoke quietly. I heard the name Fairgrove. That's the estate's name, isn't it? Indeed, Miss Marple replied. Do you recall anything else about him? His manner, perhaps? He was confident, almost commanding. Not someone you would cross lightly. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. Thank you, Alice. You've been most helpful. Later that night, as the manor settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, piecing together the day's revelations. The thread of R. Langford, the shadowed dealings over the vicarage, the mysterious visitor, all wove into a tapestry of intrigue and deceit. A sudden knock at her door startled her. Opening it revealed Dr. Hartwell, his face grave and eyes troubled. "Miss Marple, I need your counsel. There is news that may change everything." She beckoned him inside, sensing that the next turn in this labyrinth of secrets was close at hand. The game was far from over, and in the depths of Heatherley's shadows, the truth waited patiently to bloom. Dr. Hartwell stepped inside the dimly lit room, removing his coat with a deliberate care that suggested the weight of his news. His eyes met Miss Marple's with an intensity that brooked no delay. "Miss Marple, I've just received word from the laboratory regarding the samples taken from the rose in the garden." Miss Marple nodded, setting aside her knitting. "Yes, Doctor. What have they found?" Hartwell unfolded a small envelope, extracting a typed report. "The rose itself is entirely unremarkable botanically, a hybrid cultivated to bloom out of season, which explains its striking presence in the winter garden. However, the laboratory detected traces of aconitine on several of its petals." Miss Marple's fingers stilled, the knitting needles momentarily forgotten. "Aconitine on the rose petals?" "Yes," Hartwell replied. "This suggests the petals were used as a vehicle to transfer the poison, perhaps to contaminate Mr. Denham's tea or food discreetly." Miss Marple's mind raced back to the teacup, the faint residue Cray had mentioned, the moment when the cup was left unattended during Mr. Denham's brief absence. "This is a crucial piece," she said softly. "If the petals were the means of delivery, then the person responsible had not only knowledge of the poison, but also access to the rose in Mr. Denham's tea." Hartwell nodded. "Indeed. Moreover, the quantity of poison was small but lethal, indicating a precise and calculated act rather than a random attack." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window, where the rosebush stood silhouetted against the bleak sky. "We must consider who among the household or visitors had both opportunity and botanical knowledge." Hartwell pursed his lips. "The gardener, naturally, but also the victim himself, or someone close enough to handle the rose without arousing suspicion. Yet Mr. Jameson assured me the Monk's Hood patch is strictly controlled, and that the roses are treated with great care." Miss Marple reminded him. "If the poison was extracted from the garden, someone must have been careful to avoid detection." Just then, a knock echoed down the hallway, followed by Detective Sergeant Cray's entrance. "I heard the news and thought it best to join you, Miss Marple. Doctor." Cray's gaze flicked between the two, absorbing the gravity of the report. "This confirms my suspicion. Whoever poisoned Mr. Denham was methodical, had a clear plan, and knew the household well." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And yet the motive remains elusive. The financial irregularities, the threat letter, the secret visitor, all point to tangled grievances, but none offer a definitive answer." Cray sighed. "We need to delve deeper into the household's past and its hidden tensions. I plan to interview everyone again, with particular focus on those who might possess botanical knowledge or have recently handled the garden's plants." Miss Marple offered a faint smile. "As do I, Sergeant. It would be wise to observe not only their words, but their manner, those little gestures that reveal the truth beneath the mask." The afternoon passed with a quiet urgency. Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the study, where the financial ledgers awaited closer scrutiny. As she reviewed the pages with Forbes at her side, a name caught her attention: R. Langford. The irregular payments to this individual were consistent and dated back several months, yet no one in the village seemed to recognize the name. "Have you had any luck tracing this Langford?" Miss Marple inquired. Forbes shook his head. "I asked around, but no one knows of him. He might be a pseudonym." Miss Marple frowned. "That would suggest a deliberate attempt to conceal his identity." As evening drew near, the manor's uneasy calm was broken by an unexpected visitor, a tall man, impeccably dressed, whose arrival stirred a whisper among the household staff. He introduced himself as Richard Langford and claimed to have come at Lady Frances's behest to discuss urgent estate matters. Miss Marple observed him closely as he spoke with Lady Frances in the drawing-room. His manner was poised yet guarded, eyes flickering with a cautious calculation. Something in his presence felt rehearsed, as if he were guarding a secret just beneath the surface. Later, in a quiet moment, Miss Marple approached him gently. "Mr. Langford, I trust your journey was pleasant." He regarded her with a faint smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It was. I am here to assist Lady Frances with some complex financial matters concerning the estate." "And are you familiar with Mr. Denham's recent difficulties?" Langford's expression tightened, but he answered carefully. "I was brought in because of those difficulties. I regret that I did not meet Mr. Denham sooner." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a subtle challenge. "Sometimes, Mr. Langford, timing is everything." The man's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Indeed, I hope my presence will help bring clarity to these troubling times." Miss Marple nodded, though her instincts urged caution. There was more to Langford than met the eye. The next day, as the household settled into a tense routine, Miss Marple and Sergeant Cray arranged for a thorough search of the garden and greenhouse. The gardener, Mr. Jameson, accompanied them, his hands steady but his expression uneasy. Among the greenery, they found a small, carefully concealed vial near the monkshood patch, a container once holding aconitine, now almost empty. Jameson's eyes widened. "I had no idea this was here." Cray bagged the vial as evidence, turning to Miss Marple. "This confirms the poison came from the garden, but who planted it and why?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Jameson, then shifted to the freshly trimmed rose bush. "The answer lies in who had the knowledge and the opportunity." That evening, as shadows lengthened and the household gathered once more, a sudden commotion erupted near the main entrance. The butler, Mr. Wilkins, hurried inside, breathless. "Miss Marple, Sergeant, you must come quickly. There's been another incident." Miss Marple and Cray exchanged swift glances before following the butler to the source of the disturbance, a small side room near the servants' quarters. There, they found Lady Frances, pale and trembling, standing over the body of Alice Bromley, who lay collapsed on the floor, eyes closed, face ghostly. A half-empty cup of tea rested on a nearby table. Dr. Hartwell arrived promptly, checking Alice's pulse before turning to Miss Marple. "She's alive, but unconscious. It appears she has ingested something, possibly the same poison." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of tension. Miss Marple knelt beside Alice, her mind spinning. The delicate threads of this mystery were fraying fast, and the stakes had just risen higher. As the household stood in stunned silence, Miss Marple's sharp gaze swept the room. The killer's mask was slipping, and the final act was swiftly approaching. The hush that fell over Fairgrove Manor was thick enough to be cut with a knife. Alice Bromley lay on the faded rug, the early warmth of the evening extinguished from her cheeks. Dr. Hartwell knelt beside her, fingers pressing lightly against her wrist. His face was grim as he shook his head ever so slightly. "She's stable for now," he said quietly. "But the poison is fast-acting. Without immediate treatment, the outcome could have been tragic." Miss Marple exhaled, relief mingling with a sharper pang of concern. The fact that Alice was alive did not lessen the gravity of the situation. On the contrary, it underscored the desperation and recklessness of the person who had twice attempted murder within these walls. Sergeant Cray moved among the assembled household, taking statements with a firm but calm manner. Miss Marple watched the subtle shifts in behavior, noting the tightening of jaws, the quick exchanges of glances, the faltering footsteps of those whose alibis were thin. Lady Frances stood near the doorway, composed yet visibly shaken. Her pale hands gripped the arm of a chair as if to steady herself. When Miss Marple approached, she offered a small nod, her eyes weary but resolute. "I fear this has changed everything," Lady Frances murmured. "No one is safe, and suspicion breeds like wildfire." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Lady Frances, But truth, when unveiled gently, can calm even the most troubled waters. Later, as the household retired for the night under an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple found herself in the library once again, joined by Sergeant Cray and Dr. Hartwell. The gravity of the new attempt on Alice's life demanded fresh scrutiny. "We must consider," Miss Marple began softly, "the possibility that the second attempt was not merely to harm, but to send a message, one aimed at silencing someone who might have uncovered too much." Cray nodded. "Alice's role has been largely overlooked, but perhaps she knew more than she let on. Someone might have feared her discovery." Hartwell added, "or her willingness to speak." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the fire, flames dancing and crackling. "Do we know where Alice was before the tea was served? Who was with her?" Cray tapped his notebook thoughtfully. "She was in the kitchen, assisting the staff, but someone was seen speaking with her briefly in the garden earlier in the afternoon. A figure whose identity has yet to be confirmed." Miss Marple's interest peaked. "A visitor, perhaps?" "Possibly. The servants noticed it was a man, tall, dark-haired, and well-dressed," Cray reported. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the morning's events. The arrival of Richard Langford, his poised demeanor, his claim to assist with the estate's finances. Could he be linked to Alice's encounter? Could the mysterious man be more involved than he let on? The following day dawned cold and overcast, the mist clinging stubbornly to the ground. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly observing the household, weaving herself into the fabric of daily life while gathering subtle clues from conversations and glances. She visited the garden once more, pausing to examine the rose bush that had borne the poisoned petals. The carefully tended plant seemed at odds with the dark secrets it now symbolized. Nearby, Mr. Jameson, the gardener, was pruning hedges with an air of distracted focus. "Mr. Jameson," Miss Marple began, "have you noticed anything unusual in the garden these past days? Any strangers or unexpected activity?" Jameson wiped sweat from his brow, glancing around before answering. "Not much, Miss Marple, though I did see a man lingering near the gate 2 afternoons ago. He was watching the garden, but I couldn't see his face clearly." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Did he resemble Mr. Langford?" The gardener shook his head slowly. "I don't rightly know. He was too far off, but he had the same kind of poise." Later, as Miss Marple walked through the village, she overheard murmurs among the market-goers. The story of the poisoning had spread, wrapped in layers of conjecture and gossip. At the village post office, Mrs. Pennington whispered to a group of women, "I heard Mr. Denham had enemies even among his own kin. There was talk of a feud, you know. Money does strange things to families." Miss Marple, though standing quietly at the periphery, caught the note of certainty in the tone, a conviction born of long acquaintance with the village's undercurrents. She decided it was time to speak once more with Lady Frances's sister, Miss Margaret Fairgrove, whose presence at the manor had been quiet but observant. Miss Marple found her in the drawing-room, seated by the window with a book left forgotten in her lap. "Margaret, may I trouble you for a moment?" The younger woman looked up, eyes wary but polite. "Of course, Miss Marple. Have you noticed anything unusual among the household or in the village since Mr. Denham's death?" Margaret hesitated, then said softly, "There have been whispers about the estate, the old disputes over land and money, but also about Julian himself. He was not without his faults." Miss Marple encouraged gently. "What sort of faults?" Margaret's lips pressed thin. "He could be ruthless when pushed. There was a time he threatened to disinherit family members if they didn't fall in line. Some feared him." The detectives mind-catalogued these revelations alongside the financial irregularities and the mysterious Langford. The tangled web of resentments, betrayals, and fear was growing thicker. That evening, Miss Marple requested a private audience with Lady Frances. The two women sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows. "Lady Frances," Miss Marple began carefully. "There is much beneath the surface that we have yet to understand. The arrival of Mr. Langford, the secret payments, the poison on the rose petals, all suggest someone with both motive and means." Lady Frances sighed. "You speak truth, Miss Marple, but who among us could be capable of such cold calculation?" Miss Marple's eyes held steady. "Sometimes it is not the obvious suspect, but the one who wears their innocence most convincingly." Just then, a soft knock interrupted them. The butler entered quietly, handing Miss Marple a folded note found slipped beneath the library door. Breaking the seal, she read aloud. To Miss Marple. "You are closer than you think, but beware. Not all who smile are friends. Watch the rose closely. It holds the last secret." Lady Frances's fingers trembled. "Another threat?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Or a challenge? Whoever wrote this wants to unsettle us, to steer suspicion away from themselves." As the night deepened, Miss Marple sat by the window, the note folded in her hand. Outside, the garden lay cloaked in shadow. The winter rose silent and enigmatic. Somewhere among the manor's inhabitants, the truth waited, concealed beneath layers of fear and deception. The next day promised answers, but also peril. The rose that bloomed in winter was a symbol not just of beauty, but of something darker, an invitation to uncover the chilling heart of the mystery that bound them all. The chill of early morning seeped through the heavy curtains of Fairgrove Manor, casting a pale light over the quiet rooms as the household stirred into a day heavy with anticipation and unease. Miss Marple, seated at the breakfast table, found her thoughts swirling with the weight of the cryptic note and the unspoken fears that had settled like dust over the estate. The soft clink of china and murmurs of the household punctuated the room, but beneath the surface, tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike. Sergeant Cray entered briskly, nodding a greeting to Miss Marple before taking a seat opposite her. "The staff have been interviewed again," he reported quietly. "No new information, but there's a palpable nervousness. It's as if they're waiting for something to happen." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Understandable, considering. It is often in the stillness before the storm that secrets are most vulnerable. We must be patient, yet vigilant." As the breakfast concluded, Miss Marple excused herself to walk through the manor's corridors, her eyes keenly observing the faces that passed her by. Some guarded, others weary, and a few tinged with an anxious edge. She found herself drawn to the drawing room, where Lady Frances sat with Richard Langford, their conversation hushed but intense. Their expressions were carefully controlled, yet subtle tells. A flicker of impatience in Langford's eyes, a slight tightening of Lady Frances's lips did not escape her notice. Later, when Langford had departed to attend to estate matters, Miss Marple approached Lady Frances gently. "You seem troubled, Lady Frances. Is there something you wish to share?" Lady Frances sighed, her composure faltering for a moment. "The estate's finances are more precarious than I admitted. Julian's dealings were complex, and Langford's arrival, while helpful, has not eased my worries. Financial strain often breeds desperation," Miss Marple observed softly. "Desperation can lead to dark deeds." Lady Frances gave a hollow laugh. "You speak as though you have seen it before." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "I have, and that is why I watch carefully. Sometimes the smallest detail reveals the greatest truth." That afternoon, the detective and Sergeant Cray made their way to the garden once more. The rose bush, stoic in its winter bloom, seemed almost to mock their inquiries with its silent beauty. Jameson joined them, looking uncharacteristically unsettled. "Mr. Jameson," Miss Marple began, "is there anyone in the village who might harbor ill will toward the Denhams or the estate? Even someone who seems harmless at first glance?" Jameson considered this. "There's old Mrs. Pritchard, the widow who lives by the lane. She's never cared for the family, especially Julian, after a land dispute years ago." "And have you noticed her near the garden or the house lately?" "Not directly. but I did see her lurking near the gate a few days before the garden party." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Cray. "We should speak with Mrs. Pritchard." Later that day, the trio visited the widow's modest cottage on the village outskirts. Mrs. Pritchard, a sharp-eyed woman with a stooped posture and a wary demeanor, greeted them cautiously. "I heard you wanted to see me," she said, voice brittle. "Yes, Mrs. Pritchard," Cray said kindly. "We're investigating some troubling events at Fairgrove Manor. Do you know anything that might help?" She hesitated, then spat quietly. "Julian Denham was a hard man. Took more than his fair share, left us with scraps. The rose garden. Foolish, I say. The man's arrogance blinded him." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Did you happen to be near the manor around the time of the garden party, or in recent days?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes flickered. Then she nodded slowly. "I was. I watch what goes on. Saw a man, tall, dark-haired, talking to Alice Bromley by the garden. Didn't catch his name." "Did you see him enter the grounds or leave?" Cray pressed. "Both. He came through the gate like he belonged there, then left after a short while." She looked at them sharply. "You think I know more, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Sometimes the smallest observations carry great weight. Thank you, Mrs. Pritchard." As they left, Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to shift. The man Mrs. Pritchard described bore a striking resemblance to Richard Langford's earlier visit. Was Langford's connection to the estate more entangled than Lady Frances had let on? Returning to the manor, Miss Marple found Forbes in the library, poring over estate records. "Forbes," she said quietly, "have you noticed any recent visitors, other than Mr. Langford?" He looked up, brow furrowed. "Only a solicitor from London last week. Called herself Miss Harding, brief but businesslike." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. And what was her purpose? For estate legal matters, apparently. She left documents to be reviewed by Lady Frances. The plot thickened. Could Miss Harding be a piece of this puzzle? That evening, as the manor settled under a thickening fog, Miss Marple requested a meeting with Lady Frances and Sergeant Cray. In the privacy of the drawing-room, she laid out her thoughts. "Lady Frances, the threats, the poisonings, the mysterious visitors, they are not random. They point to a deliberate attempt to seize control of the estate or settle old scores." Lady Frances's face paled. But who would go so far? Miss Marple looked toward Sergeant Cray. "That is the question. I believe Mr. Langford's arrival and the solicitor Miss Harding's visit are more than coincidental. They may be orchestrated by the same hand." Cray nodded. "We need to bring them both in for questioning." Before they could proceed, a sharp rap sounded at the door. The butler entered, carrying a sealed envelope marked with the Denham family crest. Lady Frances broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the contents rapidly. "It's from Julian's lawyer," she announced. "There's a codicil to the will. It names a beneficiary previously unknown. Someone with the initials R.L. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Richard Langford." Lady Frances's voice trembled. "It appears he had a claim, but the circumstances are unclear." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Now we have motive. Financial gain intertwined with secrets, threats, and murder." As the night deepened, the manor braced for the unraveling of hidden truths. Miss Marple's mind was a careful web of insight and observation, ready to ensnare the culprit who had so cunningly cloaked themselves in the winter rose's deceptive bloom. With each passing hour, the shadows grew longer, and the final pieces of the puzzle edged closer to falling into place. The dawn broke with a reluctant grayness, the skies over Fairgrove Manor heavy with low-hanging clouds that seemed to mirror the weight pressing upon the household. Miss Marple sat quietly in the library, the morning light casting soft shadows upon the scattered papers and letters that lay before her. The revelation of the codicil had shifted the terrain of suspicion sharply. The delicate balance of secrets, motives, and alliances was beginning to fracture. Sergeant Cray arrived promptly, his expression taut with determination. "Miss Marple, I've arranged for Mr. Langford and Miss Harding to come to the manor this afternoon. We shall question them in turn." "Excellent," Miss Marple replied. "It is time we gently peel back the layers and see who trembles beneath the facade." The hours until their arrival were filled with quiet preparation. Lady Frances moved through the house with a fragile composure, while the servants kept their distance, whispers trailing behind them like ghosts. Miss Marple used the time to revisit her notes, reflecting on the subtle clues gathered, the whispered threats, the carefully planted poison, the watchful eyes of the villagers. When the clock chimed 2, the doorbell echoed through the hall. The butler announced Mr. Richard Langford first. He entered with an air of composed confidence, his dark eyes bright with a mixture of curiosity and veiled calculation. Close behind him was Miss Clara Harding, the solicitor, whose demeanor was crisp and professional, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. Miss Marple greeted them with her characteristic calm warmth. "Mr. Langford, Miss Harding, thank you for coming. We have much to discuss regarding the late Mr. Denham's affairs and recent unfortunate events." Richard inclined his head smoothly. "I'm happy to assist in any way I can." Miss Marple's gaze settled on him thoughtfully. "Mr. Langford, your connection to Mr. Denham was, until recently, not widely known in the village. Care to elaborate on your relationship?" Langford's smile was polite but guarded. "We had a professional association. I was managing some financial interests on behalf of the family. I was unaware of the codicil until yesterday." "And yet," Miss Marple pressed gently, "the initials R.L. appear in the codicil, naming a beneficiary. A coincidence, do you think?" Langford's smile faltered for the briefest moment before returning. "Not a coincidence, I admit. I had hoped my connection would remain discreet until the estate was settled." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Discretion is often a double-edged sword. Tell me, Mr. Langford, where were you on the afternoon of the garden party?" "I was in the village, attending to a meeting," he replied without hesitation. Sergeant Cray interjected. "Several villagers reported seeing you near the manor gate shortly before the poisoning." Langford's gaze shifted briefly. "I did enter the grounds to speak with Alice Bromley. She had questions about the estate's management. Questions that might have led her into danger." Miss Marple's tone was soft, yet firm. Langford shook his head. "I had no intention to harm anyone." Miss Marple turned to Miss Harding. "And you, Miss Harding, your visit was brief but significant. What was the nature of the codicil, and why was it kept from Lady Frances until now?" Clara Harding adjusted her gloves, eyes steady. "The codicil was a late addition by Mr. Denham. It named Mr. Langford as a beneficiary, due to a loan he provided to the estate. The delay in revealing it was due to pending legal matters." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "And did you notice anything unusual about the estate's affairs or the household while you were here?" Miss Harding hesitated, then said quietly, "There was tension. More than financial, personal conflicts simmering beneath the surface. As the questioning progressed, subtle inconsistencies emerged in Langford's account. His knowledge of the household's dynamics was more intimate than he admitted, and his expressions occasionally betrayed irritation when pressed on certain details. Miss Harding, meanwhile, seemed to carry a burden she was reluctant to disclose fully. After their departure, Miss Marple and Sergeant Cray reviewed the information. "Mr. Langford's motives are clear. Financial gain, a rightful claim," Cray observed, "but his demeanor suggests he might know more than he admits." Miss Marple nodded. "And Miss Harding's reticence hints at secrets that bind her to the estate in ways beyond paperwork." Their discussion was interrupted by a sudden knock. Lady Frances entered, clutching a small bundle of papers. "I found these in Julian's study, letters addressed to him from someone signing only as E. They speak of old grievances and warnings." Miss Marple took the letters and scanned them carefully. The handwriting was elegant, the tone bitter and insistent. One letter warned of consequences if Julian did not cease his demands over family land. Another hinted at a hidden liaison and a betrayal that cut deep. "These letters suggest a vendetta," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone close to Julian, or someone he wronged long ago." The afternoon wore on, with a growing sense of unease. Miss Marple decided to revisit the scene of the poisoning under the fading light. The rosebush, now shadowed by the coming dusk, seemed almost alive with silent accusation. As she examined the soil in the surrounding area, a faint imprint caught her eye, a small shoe print partially obscured by fallen leaves. Kneeling, she traced the edge with a finger. It was delicate, likely a woman's, and fresh. Her thoughts turned to Alice Bromley, the young assistant who had survived the poisonings but had remained notably quiet since the second attempt on her life. Miss Marple resolved to speak with her again, suspecting the girl held truths she was too frightened to reveal. Back inside, Miss Marple found Alice seated by the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes downcast. "Alice," Miss Marple said gently, "I understand this has been a terrible ordeal, but your safety and the truth are paramount. Is there anything you have not told us?" Alice's voice trembled as she spoke. "There is someone who warned me to stay silent. I feared what would happen if I spoke." "Who warned you?" Miss Marple's tone was encouraging, patient. Alice hesitated, then whispered, "It was Miss Harding." The name landed heavily in the room. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the layers, the solicitor's sudden nervousness, the mysterious letters, the codicil favoring Langford, and now this threat. Why would she do that? Alice's question hung in the air. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Perhaps because the secrets buried here are tangled, and protecting one means silencing another. The investigation had deepened beyond financial intrigue into a web of personal vendettas and fear. The winter rose's bloom was no longer just a symbol of beauty amid coldness, but a marker of human frailty and dangerous ambition. That night, Miss Marple sat in her room, penning her thoughts. The final test was near, the subtle psychological game she would play to draw out the truth hidden beneath polite smiles and practiced innocence. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, and with it, the resolution of the mystery that had gripped Fairgrove Manor in its icy embrace. The morning sun cast a pale light over Fairgrove Manor, yet beneath the gentle illumination, a tension thickened the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Miss Marple, her knitting paused on her lap, sat by the window of the sitting room, eyes quietly observing the comings and goings beyond the glass. The garden beyond, where the winter-blooming rose still stood, seemed almost serene, but the tranquility belied the storm that was gathering within these walls. Sergeant Cray entered with purposeful steps. "Miss Marple, I've spoken to the villagers again. Rumors about Miss Harding have begun to circulate. It seems she wasn't entirely forthcoming about her past." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Such shadows often follow those who deal in secrets, but it is how one weaves their story that reveals their truth." Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Frances, whose pale features bore the unmistakable strain of sleepless nights. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I believe it is time we confront Miss Harding and Mr. Langford together. The threads of this mystery are entwined too tightly to unravel separately." Miss Marple agreed. "A wise decision. There is power in the interplay of truth and deception when the players are gathered in one room." The drawing room was prepared accordingly, with a circle of chairs arranged to encourage openness, yet allow keen observation. When Miss Harding and Langford arrived, their faces were masks of polite composure, but subtle glances passed between them, silent communication hinting at alliance or apprehension. Miss Marple began gently, "Miss Harding, Mr. Langford, thank you for returning. We have come to a crossroads where the veil must be lifted and the heart of the matter revealed. Langford offered a measured smile. We are at your disposal. Miss Harding's eyes, however, flickered with a nervous energy that betrayed her calm exterior. I hope this will be swift. The strain of suspicion weighs heavily. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. I understand. Let us begin with the codicil. Mr. Langford, you stand to gain greatly from its contents. Was this your first awareness of the document? Langford hesitated a fraction before replying. Yes, I was unaware until Lady Frances informed me. And yet, Miss Marple pressed, you were seen near the manor gate in the days preceding the garden party. What business required such visits? I was discussing financial matters with Lady Frances, he said smoothly. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Lady Frances, who nodded. That is correct. Turning to Miss Harding, Miss Marple asked, you drafted the codicil. Did Mr. Denham confide in you about any threats or concerns? Miss Harding's hands tightened around her purse. He spoke of old family disputes resurfacing, but never specific threats. Julian was confident in his position. But confidence can be a mask, Miss Marple murmured. Were you aware of any liaison between Mr. Denham and others that might have sparked resentment? Miss Harding's breath caught slightly. There were rumors, but nothing confirmed. At this, Langford shifted uneasily, and Miss Marple noted it with care. The conversation grew taut, each participant measuring their words, cautious yet revealing. Miss Marple's subtle questioning began to unsettle the veneer of control Langford and Harding sought to maintain. After a pause, Miss Marple leaned forward. Mr. Langford, you described your relationship with Julian as professional, yet you seem intimately familiar with the estate's affairs. And Miss Harding, your presence here is more than mere legal duty, is it not? Langford's jaw tightened, and Miss Harding's eyes darted briefly toward him before settling again. Miss Marple's voice took on a gentle but firm tone. The rose bush in the garden was poisoned not once, but twice. Miss Bromley nearly lost her life. Such actions require motive and opportunity. Langford stood abruptly, voice low but sharp. You imply I had a hand in these acts? Not imply, Miss Marple corrected calmly, but seek to understand all possibilities. Langford's composure cracked just for a heartbeat. I did what was necessary to protect my interests. Julian was reckless and jeopardized the estate's future. And Miss Harding, Miss Marple inquired, her eyes never leaving the solicitor's face. Did you know more than you disclosed? Did you threaten Miss Bromley to keep her silent? Miss Harding's breath hitched. I wanted to protect the family's reputation. I did not wish harm on anyone. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting. Protection can breed concealment, and concealment can lead to tragedy. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken accusations, and Sergeant Cray stepped forward. Miss Marple, if I may, I found this in Miss Harding's room. He produced a small leather-bound diary. Miss Harding's face paled. That is private. Miss Marple opened it with a steady hand, flipping through pages filled with meticulous notes. Details of conversations, observations about the household, and most intriguingly, entries revealing a past relationship between Harding and a member of the Denham family, a connection that complicated the narrative further. Miss Harding, Miss Marple said softly, your history here is tangled in ways you have yet to admit. Tears welled in Harding's eyes. I loved Julian once. I tried to warn him of the dangers, but he would not listen. And when you saw the threat to the estate, you acted to safeguard it. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Yes, Harding whispered, but I never intended for anyone to be hurt. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Intentions are often overshadowed by outcomes. Turning to Langford, she continued, and you, Mr. Langford, your ambitions drove you to cross lines. Langford's eyes darkened. I admit my desire for the estate was strong, But I did not commit murder. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Number, the true culprit sought to hide behind your ambitions. The room fell silent, the tension electric. Miss Marple then spoke of the footprints near the rose bush, the threats whispered to Miss Bromley, and the anonymous letters. Each piece was laid carefully before them. It was a web of fear and greed, Miss Marple concluded, but only one thread leads directly to the murder. Her eyes settled on Lady Frances, who had remained silent throughout, her face pale but composed. Lady Frances, Miss Marple said quietly, you were burdened by the estate's precarious finances and the encroaching influence of outsiders. You feared losing all you held dear. Lady Frances looked away, then back, her voice trembling. I did what I thought necessary to protect my family and legacy. Miss Marple's voice softened. But in doing so, you allowed desperation to drive your hand. Lady Frances lowered her gaze. I did not mean for Julian to die. No one does at first, Miss Marple replied. But sometimes, the rose that blooms in winter carries a deadly thorn. The confession unfolded, the subtle poisoning, the carefully masked threats, the manipulation of those around her, all in an effort to regain control and preserve the estate's future. Sergeant Cray moved forward to place Lady Frances under arrest, her composure breaking as the weight of her actions settled upon her. As the household absorbed the shock, Miss Marple sat back, knitting once more, her eyes reflecting the quiet sadness of human frailty. The mystery was resolved, yet the scars it left would linger like shadows in the manor's corners. Outside, the winter rose still bloomed, a poignant reminder that beauty and danger often entwine in the most unexpected ways. The room had fallen into a heavy silence, the kind that presses down on one's chest and refuses to be broken by hurried words or frantic gestures. Lady Frances Denham sat quietly, her usual proud composure replaced by a subdued acceptance. Sergeant Cray stood nearby, ready to escort her away, while the other household members looked on, their faces a mixture of shock, sorrow, and reluctant understanding. Miss Marple, knitting calmly, surveyed the scene with the quiet patience of someone who had long known how human nature unfolds in the face of desperation and fear. It was you, Lady Frances, Miss Marple began softly, who saw your family's legacy slipping through your fingers and chose to grasp at any means, however dark, to keep it within reach. Lady Frances's gaze dropped, trembling. I didn't mean for Julian to die. It was supposed to scare him, to make him reconsider his reckless demands. The poison was to be mild, a warning, but things spiraled out of control. Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle yet firm. The rosebush in your garden, blooming in the dead of winter, was your message. A symbol of defiance, but the beauty concealed a deadly thorn. You sought to silence those who threatened your plans. First Mr. Denham, then poor Alice Bromley when she discovered your involvement. The assembled faces reflected a mix of emotions, betrayal, sorrow, relief, as the pieces fell into place. The codicil favoring Mr. Langford was indeed genuine, but had been manipulated, and the apparent motives of others were smokescreens masking the deeper truth. Miss Harding's concealed affections and fears, Langford's financial ambitions, even Alice's silent terror, all were collateral damage in Lady Frances's desperate gambit. Why the threats to Miss Harding? Sergeant Cray asked, stepping closer. Lady Frances's voice cracked. She came too close to the truth. I thought if I frightened her enough, she would keep silent, but fear can also be a catalyst for courage, as we have seen. Miss Marple looked toward Alice, whose pale eyes now held a spark of bravery. It takes great strength to face such danger and still speak the truth. Turning to the group, Miss Marple concluded, this tragedy reminds us that beneath the calm surface of any village lies a complex web of emotions, resentments, and secret fears. The winter rose blooms against the odds. but it bears thorns sharp enough to wound deeply. As Lady Frances was led away, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, weary smile. The quiet village of Fairgrove would soon settle once more into its gentle rhythms, though the echoes of betrayal and loss would linger like a faint chill on the air. Returning to her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on human nature, its resilience and its frailty, its capacity for kindness and for cruelty. The garden outside was still grey and cold, but that stubborn rose, blooming in defiance of the season, remained a silent testament to the complicated beauty of life itself.